So Peter, thanks for joining us today. I appreciate you making the time.
Thanks, Jeff. Good to be here.
So according to ESG research, we see about 24% of end users saying in the next 12 to 24 months, they're going to be seriously considering private cloud. Now that's a pretty low number compared to the hype you hear about cloud out there. Why do you think more people aren't gravitating towards the private cloud model?
So a couple of reasons, but first of all, let's define the cloud. It's basically a consumption-based model that's tied to almost like utility computing, where you leverage the highest ROI from the resources. I think one of the first reasons is not knowing the underlying infrastructure, the plumbing that's there. That leads to how do you define what you can possibly move to the cloud? And that becomes the first big challenge. The second big challenge is when you do look to move to private clouds, is to understanding that you basically can only move as of today VM environments or virtualized environments, which leaves another subset of large production mission critical applications tied to Unix-based environments that can't be moved. So I think a couple of those things are key.
So assuming you can get by some of those barriers and think that through, what do you think is the best first step for companies to take? So I say, I'm going to do private cloud now. What do they need to be thinking? What are the first steps?
First step is to address the problem that I mentioned earlier, which is discovery. Knowing what you have in terms of your infrastructure, being able to tie server, fabric, storage, the interdependency back to the application layer, and determining what resources are you using today to determining what resources you'll need moving forward on the actual private side cloud-based. Right. The second big challenge is to make sure you plan correctly and understand the impact of moving will have in terms of migration effects, outage windows, coordination, leveraging all teams, including the sys administrators, DBAs, application owners, facilities, storage team, et cetera, in planning and coordinating the activities related to the cloud.
So what then are some of those key issues that people should be thinking of while they're planning that? Or are there any major things that you think should be at the top of the list for planning?
Yeah, I think from a planning perspective, one, interdependency mapping is absolutely key. Secondly, knowing what the utilization levels are and what tiers they're running on so you can determine a better performance impact. The third important thing is to be able to do ongoing discoveries so that you don't have any issues in terms of you changed your infrastructure when you look to actually move to it. And the other aspect I would say is making sure you understand what performance you're expecting on the target side when you look to move to a private cloud.
So that sounds like a lot, right?
That is a lot.
That's a lot for people to handle. So great, you've had a successful project, you've gotten there, you've migrated data into the private cloud. How do you keep it current? And I mean, what happens if you need to move that infrastructure back, out of either a private cloud or a public cloud? How do you keep that data fresh?
Yeah, it's a big challenge. I think a couple of things to be cognizant of. One is to make sure that you do constant discovery and collection of your information in terms of your metadata, knowing how those interdependencies link even on the private cloud. It's more important on the private cloud because you're going to be charged based on the consumption or usage of that. So it's very important to keep the constant discovery. The second aspect is to be able to know how your application ties back to your storage to be able to move it back. Should you want to move it back to a traditional infrastructure versus a utility-based infrastructure?
So how do you think public cloud differs? Are the people going to go through the same type of thought process? Right now it's kind of a controlled environment. They can get a handle on their assets. If they start to consider public cloud, what kind of gotchas or different things do they even need to be thinking about? Are people thinking that through enough, do you think, that someday I might have to come back from Amazon?
Yeah, I don't think people really think that way, right? It's the same way as people think of virtualization. They think of the move there, but they really don't think of the what ifs to come back. And that come back has to be really thought out because you don't want the dependency that you always need that vendor or that internal party to always manage your infrastructure because you can never bring it back. I think in a public cloud, it's even harder because you have multiple business units across multiple companies coming into the same infrastructure. So there's a lot more intertwining per se that needs to be managed. And then from a cloud provider standpoint of the public cloud, they still face the same plumbing challenges and the utilization management challenges that private entities face today.
Yeah, and they certainly face a lot of the same challenges. As we're sitting here filming this, we're filming this a week after Amazon's major outage. So I'll bet there's a lot of people who are thinking, geez, we wish we had a plan to fail over or come back or know where all our assets are.
Absolutely. You have to plan for the worst. And at least in the private world, you have control over your infrastructure to some extent. In the public world, you're reliant totally on that party to make sure that they're managing your infrastructure effectively.
So how does SANpulse help in all of this? What's your value proposition to people going for the private
Sure.
cloud?
SANpulse takes you through the entire journey of getting to the cloud. That includes first initial discovery. We use a product called SANatomy to be able to go in and discover your environment and infrastructure and be able to report on how your interdependencies lay out from server to fabric to the storage layers. From there, we actually take you on the migration journey through our product called SANLogix. We help drive the automation and facilitate the migration from your existing environment to a cloud-based infrastructure and ensure that we drive it with the least amount of risk and remove the migration challenges that manual transitions take. So that move to the cloud is automated through discovery, ongoing discovery to make sure we capture any changes. And then the actual migration process becomes an automated process in terms of facilitating the actual work files and the workflow that's required to get to the cloud infrastructure.